Once More with Feeling by Wetpretzel. Read by LMX Marbella. Chapter 4. Laura Medley was a competent enough assistant. She sorted through Hermione's mails, tossing out howlers and cursed envelopes before they could reach Hermione's desk, knew what cases had to be on Hermione's desk in order of importance, records from the archives were extracted and returned on schedule. Medley even took the liberty of bringing Hermione morning coffee when she arrived to start her shift in the morning, her assistant sipping on her own concoction of sugar, cream, and syrup that had Hermione wincing on behalf of her dentist parents. Medley knew not to take it personally when Hermione got snappy if pages were missing from an old archived case study, and would even work well past end of office hours to track down the information Hermione needed for a proposal with nary a complaint. So yes, all things considered, Medley was a very competent assistant, except for one flaw. Medley loved gossip. Hermione sat at her desk, eyes boring into the investigation report from Jorkin's cockroaches farm in an attempt to draw out her assistant's high-pitched nattering over two male employees who had been caught in the same loo cubicle, as she sat on the floor sifting through previous transcription of Wizengamot hearings. Medley's gifted ability to do multiple tasks at once without any mistakes was the only reason Hermione hadn't sent her off to the archives.
Definitely not a Muggle artifact, you know, Daphne, right?
She didn't.
Well, she's absolutely devastated. Apparently, her and William had a moment at the Valentine's Gala, and she was all gearing up to ask him to Beltane next month. Ooh, didn't Thomas ask you out last year? I wonder if he'd try again. Oh, but then again, Mr. Muff. Wait, what was I saying? Oh, yes. Anyway, Daphne, poor girl. She'd spent over 50 gallons of weight loss potions. Something about William liking.
The Hogwarts school song ran through Hermione's head as her hand twitched and arched to cast a quick silencio in Medley's direction. The last 3 days had Hermione feeling like she was back in the Gryffindor dormitories, listening to Lavender and Parvati babble on well into the night over which of their classmates had gotten fat over the holidays, and ooh, did Parvati think Seamus was keen on Lavender?
So now Daphne has like this big complex and she's crying in the loose at lunch, thinking she might have turned him and like, what if she turned all of her exes? And I'm not being funny or nothing, don't get me wrong, but have you seen the way William dresses? If that wasn't a big enough hint.
Draco couldn't come home soon enough. He'd left a few days prior. A billywig smuggled in from Brisbane has escaped his owner and was causing all sorts of mischief down in the small town of Somerset. Draco had been summoned to help the Aurors handle the Muggles, of whom were baffled and panicked at why a third of its residents were all levitating in the shops, streets, and homes. Hermione read in the Prophet that the Muggles had suspected chemical warfare from Russia, and she couldn't help but snort at the image of Russian Muggle government viewing the residents of Bathpool as a threat. But Draco leaving for the other side of the country evidently didn't put a stop to his meddling. The same day Draco had left, while Hermione was poring over her notes on the inhumane methods poachers used to obtain cockatrice eyeballs, a popping sound went through her office. She looked up, startled to the sight of a familiar lunchbox, foggy and steamy, evidently recently heated up, perched on the end of her desk. There had been a letter to the lid that made Hermione both flush and scald at its content. Dearest Granger, try not to die of malnourishment in my absence, and eat some actual food. I've counted them, and those bloody biscuits of yours best still have 8 left when I get back. And no, before any howls come my way, my house elves did not cook this. It's been preserved with a stasis charm. My elves will have, if they follow my instructions properly, for I have many a spare sock lying around, reheated the food since I don't own a microwave. If you can find in your bleeding Gryffindor heart to forgive my trespasses, I would greatly appreciate it. I do look forward to recounting those biscuits of yours upon my return, Granger. D.M. P.S. Stop slouching. Hermione had debated not eating the food out of spite when she found herself straightening her posture after reading the footnote of his letter. But then her stomach had rumbled quite painfully, and so Hermione reached out for the Tupperware with only a slight pout on her lips. She supposed she could always finish off her biscuits over the next few days, buy another packet, and simply take out 2 of them. The punsy pret would be never the wiser.
Been delivered yet, Miss Granger?
Hermione's head snapped forwards, meeting the questioning eyes of her assistant. A faint blush bloomed across her neck as she smiled apologetically at her. I'm sorry, Laura. I was a million miles away. What did you say?
Should I check with Matilda on the front desk to see if the basilisk legislation has been delivered yet?
Medley repeated. Oh, yes, please, Hermione said, and nodded towards her office door, her eyes catching the time on the clock. You might as well take your lunch back now as well, before all that's left of the cafeteria is the egg sandwich. Hermione sighed in exacerbation when, half an hour later, a Tupperware container appeared on her desk. Honestly, she grumbled as she forked out a few overcooked chunks of pork, his mothering could give Molly Weasley a run for her money. The image of Draco sitting with Molly and knitting Christmas jumpers made her choke on a potato, and she just imagined to control her coughing when Medley returned through the door, the basilisk files in her hand. Hermione held out her hand for the file and almost missed the way Medley's eyes flickered between her and the container, a small knowing smile on her assistant's lips as she handed the documents over.
Do you know when Mr. Malfoy will be returning?
Medley's voice was innocent enough, but Hermione recognized the vulture's glint in her eyes that had often resided in Rita Skeeter, and Hermione couldn't help but think that Medley's talents were wasted in the ministry. She'd thrive on a daily profit, getting paid to gossip for a living. He'll return when his job is completed, Hermione said coolly and raised a brow at her assistant. Have you finished with the court transcript?
I just have one more to go through,
Medley said as she returned to sit in a lotus position on the office floor. Hermione managed to get through 3 pages of the basilisk legislation in blissful silence before Medley decided Hermione must simply have the updates on the Daphne William debacle. Hermione glanced mournfully at the empty desk next to hers, her chest clenching wistfully as she pictured a tall blonde poncy wizard sitting there. No doubt he'd give her assistants the same look of disdain Hermione internally wore, and Hermione had to chew on the inside of her cheek to hold back the heavy sigh that burnt in her throat.
The look on her face when he walked in with Frank, it was priceless. Like, I'm not being stereotypical or anything. My cousin Tan is gay, so I'm not being funny for saying this, but the man wore more pink than Umbridge. Like, how did she not put the pieces?
Merlin. How she missed the peaceful silence the pair would bask in as they worked their way through Draco's to-do task list. How long did it take to catch one Billywick anyway? Her biscuit drawer remained unopened for the rest of the week, only because Hermione was too preoccupied with her work to justify a biscuit break, of course. The moon gleamed through the gap in her curtains, its silvery rays painted across her walls and ceiling as Hermione shifted in her bed for what felt like the 100th time that night. Her eyes fell on the clock on her nightstand, the red LED numbers telling her it had just gone past 4 in the morning, and she let out a resigned huff as she sat up in bed. It seemed she would not be getting any sleep that night either. Perhaps she needed a new mattress. Draco had certainly complained for the dexterity of his spine more than a dozen times. I might as well be sleeping on a bed of rocks, he grumbled into the back of her neck. I'm sure the 24 goose pillows down in your manor are getting lonely, Hermione said sleepily, interlocking their fingers as his hand came around her waist to envelop hers. Feel free to pay them a visit. Draco just hummed, his knee pushing between her thighs as he settled behind her. I'll be sure to do that tomorrow. The next night, as Hermione was still catching her breath against his chest from her orgasm, he told Hermione to watch out for the bill from his chiropractor. Hermione sighed again as she slipped out of bed, cursing as she tripped over Draco's Quidditch jersey. Honestly, how hard was it for him to keep it hung up in the wardrobe? The stress of the quickly approaching hearing must have been why Hermione couldn't sleep, she thought as she made her way down the corridor to make herself a much-needed cup of tea. Crookshanks was sleeping peacefully on the green ottoman in her living room, his face nuzzled into what Hermione was sure was Draco's favorite pair of socks as she passed her old familiar by. His soft sleepy purrs hung in the air behind Hermione as she entered the kitchen. At least one of us is getting a good night's sleep, Hermione inwardly grumped. Her freshly brewed tea sat next to her as she summoned an old cockatrice assault court case file from her bag. Hermione figured she might as well be productive, rather than mope about all night in her too cold, too empty bed. The calendar on her desk indicated it was 2 days until her Wizengamot hearing, which meant that it had been 4 days since Hermione had managed anything more than an hour or so of sleep. She was admittedly getting a little snappy. Medley hadn't been in her office since the first hour of her shift that morning, and no doubt the little gossip had spread word of Hermione's mood, since she hadn't heard hide nor hair from any of her colleagues all morning, not even a passing conversation in the corridor. All but one person, a fresh-faced, mousy-haired witch Hermione couldn't recall seeing around the office before, who'd innocently enough knocked on her door about an hour prior and asked if Hermione had wanted a cup of tea. In hindsight, Hermione had overreacted a tad, her sparking as she'd snapped that if she wanted a beverage she would have asked for one, and if that concept was too difficult for the witch to understand, then perhaps she might want to enroll into the ministry nursery. At least that way she'd be with peers of similar comprehensive level. Maybe she'd overreacted more than a tad. With a sigh, Hermione reached out and jotted down a quick memo to send the witch she'd really need to find out her name, an apology fruit basket once her hearing was over. Just another item on her endless list of tasks to complete, Hermione inwardly grimed. Slamming the memo against the desktop with a little more force than necessary, her horse barking in multiple directions, Hermione turned her attention back to her speech she'd spent all morning preparing for when she faced the Wizengamot in a few days. She scowled as she noticed a glaring error in one of her preceding case references. 1946, not 64. Hermione, you blithering idiot! She huffed, her arms pressing together as she slammed her head against them in misery. You know, talking to yourself is the first sign of madness. Hermione stiffened at the familiar drawl. Great. On top of borderline chronic stress and sleep deprivation, now she was hallucinating. My. I'd heard on my way over here that you'd been a little testy today. Don't I even get a hello? How long did hallucinations last? Hermione frowned and slowly lifted her head up to peer over her arms. Her heart positively jumped to her throat. Draco leaned against the threshold of her office, an eyebrow quirked up in amusement as his fingers wriggled in a wave. I hear absence make the heart grow fonder. He pointed to her hair and smirked, of which was roughly 3 times its usual size. Your mane must have missed me a lot. Hermione rolled her eyes at his wry grin and concluded that he was truly standing in her office. Not even her hallucinations could be that insufferable. Her irritation rebounded, drowning out the way her heart pounded against her chest. Found your billywick, you did. Took you long enough. Draco smiled at her, and perhaps Hermione was hallucinating because his smile could have only been described as soft, intimate, like she wasn't supposed to see it. Hermione dropped her eyes away from him and belatedly regretted turning down the intern's office to make her a cup of tea. She was suddenly parched. A little owl told me you made Matilda cry yesterday. Hermione grabbed her quill, her teeth gritted as she fixed the mistake here in her speech. Good. She was being stupid, Hermione said, huffing as she spotted another factual error. She felt like she was back in the common room, marking one of Harry and Ron's old history of magic essays. Draco clicked his tongue as he peeled himself off of the door frame and crossed her office. I must say, it's been a while since I've seen this little vindictive side of you, Granger. His palms came down to rest against the edge of her desk as he leaned down conspiratorially towards her. Hermione's eyelids unwittingly flickered closed for a brief moment, apples and cedarwood overwhelming her senses. Should I warn Matilda to stock up on Madame Pimpernel's pimple potions? Only a fool would do the same trick twice, Hermione said lightly and lifted her speech up at eye level, effectively shielding her away from Draco's mischievous gaze. I don't know about that, Granger, Draco hummed, and Hermione swore he almost sounded like he was laughing. I've often found that consistency is the most effective method in getting what you want. Hermione hummed back. How was Somerset? Long, Draco said simply, and he stood up to move around the desk. Hermione's back was positively white-hot with heat as he approached from behind her, one hand coming forward to press against the edge of the desk and the other against the armchair. Her head heavy and drowsy as he leaned in to read her speech over her shoulder, his lips accidentally brushing against her ear as he did so. Merlin, did she need to sleep? Draco tittered as he read over the page, no doubt laughing at her factual errors, and Hermione's heart shuddered against her ribcage as a hand gently tilted her head to the left and soft warm lips pressed delicate kisses, once, twice, a third time, against her neck. The parchment creased under Hermione's fingers as she fought the urge to sink back into the chair and pull Draco closer. I can feel how stressed you are, Granger, Draco murmured against her skin. Yes, she was. She was so stressed. Maybe if his lips went a little lower. Given how many grammatical errors you've made in this statement. What, did you have Diggle write this for you? Hermione bristled and her mouth shut open to defend herself when Draco's lips encased her earlobe and sucked on it lightly. One of her hands leapt up to push down on Draco's jaw, and she breathed out a shaky moan as he released her ear and kissed back down her neck, stopping to suck on her pulse. Stressing about the outcome in a couple of days? Draco's nose nudged her skin, and Hermione felt his lips curve into a smirk. Shall I contact one of Father's old ministry lackeys to send a cursed heirloom to one of the Wizengamot chambers? Hermione knew he was joking, but a quiet voice in his sleep-deprived mind had her seriously considering it for a moment. Worried about my mental state, Draco? Be careful, I might actually think you care about me, she said instead. Draco's lips paused against her, and a panicked wave of regret flooded Hermione's system. She opened her mouth to claim it as a joke when Draco's teeth nipped at her collarbone. I'd just hate to see the ministry lose one of its few competent employees, Draco said eventually, his voice somewhat hoarse. His throat cleared. Merlin, forbid you end up in the loony bin, Granger. I'd hate to have to be saddled with Diggle on all of these liaison cases. Hermione snorted. The poor man doesn't come within 100 foot of this office, if you're in it. Draco, honestly, she turned to look at him suspiciously. What did you say to him to make him so afraid of you? Draco's eyes practically twinkled. What did you say to Matilda to make her cry? He countered, effectively avoiding the question. Hermione scowled at him, a shameful blush creeping up her neck as she turned away to sulkily thump at the leather top of her desk. Draco chuckled, and the blush spread to her cheeks as he kissed the back of her head. Evidently, I strike the fear of Merlin into Diggle, and you make your subordinates cry. Draco's hands tucked on her shirt to slightly expose her shoulders, and he bent down to kiss around it, his lips curving into a smile. What a pair we make! Hermione let out a laugh before she could think better of it. Draco pressed a final kiss against the nape of her neck before pulling away. Did you eat? He asked, a hand reaching down to grasp at the top drawer of her desk. His note from a few days ago ran through her mind, and Hermione huffed. Damn his velvety lips, for making her forget what prat he could be. Are you sure you caught the billywig? Hermione attempted to bat his hands away from the drawer knob. Draco simply grinned at her, his grip tightening. You know, maybe you should go back and check if you've managed to obliviate all of the muggles. She gave up trying to peel him away from her biscuit drawer and turned to lean over her speech again. I can only imagine the nightmares they must be dealing with. Your pale, pointy face is quite horror-inducing. Draco just snorted, his hand coming away from the drawer to tug playfully at her hair. Like Pavlov's dog, Hermione straightened her back instantly. I missed you too, Granger, he simply said, and bent down to grab the speech from Hermione's hands, her grip loose as her brain faltered at his words. The blood whirled in her ears, and she swallowed dryly in an attempt to drown the shaky gasp that hammered from her chest. Hermione was vaguely aware she was gaping up at him dumbly as he read her speech again. His brows furrowed and his lips pursed, his eyes scanning across the parchment. I spotted Potter and Weasley heading towards the cafeteria. He nodded towards her office door. They should still be there. You should go join them. What? Hermione blinked at him. I missed you too, Granger. Her mind still reeling, Hermione gave no resistance as Draco pulled up from her desk chair, a strong hand to her back as she was pushed gently towards the door. Go and have lunch with your friends, Granger. Even swats like you need to socialize on occasion. Draco, I can't afford to go have lunch break. I don't have time. Yes, I know. Draco rolled his eyes, the impact softened by the teasing grin on his lips. Like it was some kind of inside joke. Hermione frowned, not understanding what she was missing out on. I also know the ins and outs of this proposal, Granger. I can take over for an hour. You need a fresh pair of eyes on this speech. He waved her off, turning on his heel to head to his desk. A small sigh of relief ran through Hermione as she watched him sit back at his desk. She hadn't realized just how much she'd missed seeing him sat there. She quickly tossed that thought to the back of her mind, scowling inwardly at her ridiculousness. What kind of person missed seeing their colleague sit at a desk, load up on brain fuel, pretend to give a damn when the Wonder Twins talk about Quidditch, and then come back and we can work on this together? Draco looked up, his eyes narrowing as Hermione dragged her heels against the carpet. Of course, he carried on, slowly. If you're not up for Quidditch talk, I can always out-Pansy instead. I heard she's looking to discuss flower arrangements. Hermione darted out of the office before he could finish his sentence. November 2005. You just seem happier, like, I don't know, like the weight of the world has been lifted off of your shoulders, Harry said as the pair of them watched George and Ron argue over which fireworks to set up next. I thought that was my line, Hermione teased. Harry elbowed her gently as he rubbed absent-mindedly at his scar, an old habit from his teen years he'd not yet shaken off. James' delighted scream rang out from the safety of the patio, his chubby hands clapping together in glee as George set off a firework that exploded into a glittering red and gold lion. James echoed the lion's roar whilst trying to squirm out of Ginny's protective hold, most likely to run after his temporary pyrotechnic friend. Hermione couldn't help but notice how Ginny had avoided the butterbeer Ron had brought over all evening, and she glanced slyly at her best friend. She'd give it until the end of the week before Harry probably spilled the beans. I'm serious, Hermione. Harry looked at her, his vibrant green eyes still visible through the lenses, clouded and foggy from the ash of the bonfire and fireworks. I can't remember the last time I saw you this happy. I know your job means a lot to you. He held up his hand to stop her from interrupting. As it should. But you are no good to your department if you burn out. It's nice to see you like this again. The two of them snickered as George and Ron tussled to the ground, fighting over who got to set off the last firework. So, how come you didn't bring Malfoy? Hermione's eyes snapped to him, her eyebrows knitted together in confusion. Why would I bring Malfoy? I thought Ginny's invitation said for loved ones only. Of all people to ask her why she didn't invite their childhood nemesis, it was Harry. Sure, Draco had attended a few dinners at the Potters when she'd been forcibly invited by Ginny, But that was only so they could continue on their work and not lose their stride in whatever idea they'd been brainstorming all afternoon in her office. And sure, Draco and Harry had been perfectly cordial with one another. Heck, on one occasion they'd spent the whole evening cracking jokes between themselves about the ink stains on Hermione's face. But Hermione didn't think that that necessarily constituted Malfoy as a loved one. Harry opened his mouth to reply and then paused. His eyes searched her face. Hermione shifted uncomfortably. She had the feeling she was being hit with his or interrogation face. Whatever he was thinking, Hermione couldn't tell before his face slipped into a neutral expression. "Right," he said slowly. "My mistake." Harry continued to send her curious looks when he thought she was distracted by the sparklers Ron brought over, and Hermione felt a lick of self-consciousness creep up her spine every time she caught him staring. She probably just had bonfire ash on her face, Hermione determined, a hand wiping away at her cheek. "Can't believe I'm feeling grateful towards Malfoy," Ron groaned for the third time since the three of them sat down for lunch. He stepped a sausage with his fork and pointed it at Hermione accusingly. "If he comes to me expecting to return the favor, you can deal with it." Hermione rolled her eyes. "I don't spend lunch at my desk that often." Harry and Ron dead-spent simultaneously. "You two need new work partners," Hermione's finger wriggled between the pair. "I've heard the rumors." She snickered as the pair blushed, surreptitiously moving away from each other. "We're not the only one with rumors about our co-workers," Harry said slightly miffed as he poked at his peas on his plate. Honestly, if he didn't like them, why order them in the first place? His words processed through her mind a beat later and she looked at him questioningly. "What do you mean?" Harry yelped, a small leap from his seat as he reached down to rub his leg, shooting a filthy glare at Ron. She could only assume Ron was the culprit. "Don't listen to Hermione," Ron said, twirling his fork around his temple. "Anyone debating naming their child Severus is not of sound mind." Hermione chortled as the tips of Harry's ear flushed pink. The trio sat for another 15 minutes, conversation topics fleeting until Hermione's one burst on her table. As much as she did love her job and was relieved that Draco was finally back to help her prep, sometimes she did sorely miss just hanging out with her old friends. Hermione's lip trembled and she blinked back tears furiously. "Oh, I'm being so silly," she cried, hands furiously wiping at her tears, and she shrugged off the concerned looks from the other side of the table. "I'm just tired. I haven't really slept this week. It must all be hitting me at once," she smiled in a watery reassurance. "Really, I'm fine." "If you say so, Hermione," Ron said, a cautious smile on his face, one hand still hovering in the air towards her. "Didn't you say Malfoy was going over the case?" Harry added. "Why don't you stay another half hour?" Ron tsked, shaking his head in mock offense. "Still can't believe Hermione's willingly let another person touch her work. Remember when she'd all but rip our arms off if we so much as looked at her transfiguration essays?" "That's because you were trying to cheat, not help me," Hermione muffled from behind her hands and peeked through her fingers to glare at them accusingly. "You say cheat, I say inspire." Ron went boyishly at her when she couldn't hold back a snort. No, I really need to be heading back. Drake is waiting for me." Ron and Harry exchanged a look Hermione couldn't quite understand. "I bet he is," Ron muttered into his coffee, making Harry cough awkwardly, a hand brushing through his dark, messy hair. She raised an eyebrow at the two of them. "Of course, if you really do want to help me," she said slowly. "Draco did insist on a fresh pair of eyes." "Oh, I think I heard. I said, yeah, I think Ginny's going into labor. Gotta go." Harry shot up from his chair, smiling at her apologetically as he grabbed his robes. Hermione snickered at his retreat before turning to look at Ron expectantly. Ron just quipped a brow at her. "I wish I could, but I do not want to." It was approximately 19 hours until the Wizengamot hearing when Hermione finished her third practice run-through of her speech, and she wiped at a sweaty brow, mentally drained from all of the objections and mock questions Draco had thrown at her for the last hour. Was that last question really necessary? She panted and fixed him with a steely glare. "I highly doubt the court is going to ask me what type of feathers my bedding is made from." Draco simply shrugged. "They moved your case up by 2 months, Granger," he reminded her. "Trust me when I tell you they're going to pull every trick in the book to find a way to snag this from under your robes." He stood up from his desk and approached her. Hermione couldn't hold back the heavy sigh as he pulled her into his arms, a hand coming up to massage between her tense shoulder blades. Hermione nuzzled into his shoulder, despite a man screaming at her to keep a professional distance between them. They were in her office, after all, and anyone could just walk in and make all kinds of assumptions. But Merlin, Hermione was exhausted. She could feel Draco massaging through all the fatigued knots in her back, and she hummed in sleepy pleasure against his chest. Hermione was internally debating the ramifications on how inappropriate it would be to ask Draco for a proper massage at her flat later that evening when he spoke up. "Let me take you to dinner when all this is over." Hermione's previously loosened muscles stiffened again, and she slowly peeked herself off of his chest, just catching the way his eyes flickered cautiously, almost hesitantly, before they hardened into a determined glint. "What?" A pale hand came up to thread an escaped curl from her plait. His expression light with something akin to wonder as he played with her hair. "Have dinner with me, Granger," he repeated. "You've been working your arse off for weeks now. Give yourself this break." A lump the size of a golden snitch lodged in her throat as Hermione attempted to swallow. Her tongue flickered out to wet her lips nervously. "Draco, I've told you," she said, stepping back, and her body berated her for leaving his comforting embrace. "I don't have to—" "Time," Draco finished, and huffed out a laugh. Once again his expression twinkled with knowing amusement, although Hermione didn't miss the way his eyes tightened. Hermione Granger's never-ending quest to save the magical animal kingdom. If Hermione wasn't too busy ignoring the way her heart skipped a beat at the way her given name fell from his lips, she might have almost missed the way his tone was almost fond, wistful even. He strode towards her office door, one hand lightly tugging on her plate playfully as he passed her by. "Wait!" she called after him. Draco blinked at her expectantly. She looked down towards her shuffling feet, her hands clasped together as she asked, shyly, "Will you be there tomorrow? At the hearing?" He paused for a moment, looking her up and down before he replied a cautious, "Do you want me there?" Hermione nodded, and his eyes glinted, a smirk licking at his lips. "Consider the date, Granger," he said with a wink. A smirk spread into a full-blown grin, and he rounded the corner as Hermione blushed. The back of Hermione's neck was cold with sweat, as 50 purple-robed senior wizards stared down at her. Some glaring down at her in austere disdain, others looked like they were wondering what to have for dinner that evening. "A show of hands for those opposing the bill," the chief varlock droned, the miserable old gid's hand joining a fair few others. Hermione couldn't finish counting the hands in time before the chief called for those in favor. A burdened sigh left the chief's mouth as he nodded in Hermione's direction. Her nails dug into the palms of her hands as her ankle twitched in the urge to jump out of her seat. "So, the chambers have spoken. We will submit your proposal for legislation, Miss Granger. Congratulations." The chief sounded anything but congratulatory as he tapped the gravel against his block, his fellow gallery a wave of plump, billowing curtains as they all made for the chambers. Hermione waited until the last wizard disappeared behind the old oak doors before she bounced up from her seat, positively giddy as she turned on her heel to face the spectator benches where a certain blonde colleague of hers had sat diligently behind her for the past 2 hours. Draco met her ecstatic grin with his own triumphant smile. Her breath caught in her throat at the heat that shone in his eyes. Hermione laughed breathlessly, her feet a mind of their own as they made their way towards him, Draco's hungry stare like a siren call. She startled as Horace Jorkin's leering face appeared not inches away from her. She hadn't even noticed him approach her. "I do believe congratulations are in order, Miss Granger." Ah, yes, her nice of him to congratulate her breasts. Hermione smiled tightly at him as she lifted her arms to cross protectively against her chest. "Thank you, Mr. Jorkins. I look forward to receiving an update sense of all the livestock on your farm. I imagine there'll be quite the sudden increase of the official numbers." She stared at him challengingly, and inwardly smirked at the flicker of scratching irritation he couldn't hide in time. He blinked, and then his expression oozed into something lecherous, and he cooed at her, "My offer still stands, Miss Granger. You're welcome to come and pat my cock, Beatrice." He paused mid-syllable to pointedly toss her a leer. "I'll even make sure they're pre-wrapped up for you." A hand clapped down on his shoulder, knuckles white as long, elegant fingers dug into Jorkin's shoulder in a way that must have been quite painful, judging by the way the breeder grimaced. "I'm aware there's not much honor and decorum amongst beast breeders, but I would hope that even a man of your status would know it's unseemly to speak to a witch with such candor," Draco drawled, and artfully pushed the man away from Hermione. Jorkin's blanched recognition bleeding into his eyes as he looked up at her colleague. He flitted his eyes between the two of them and clenched his jaw as he bowed to Hermione. "I'll send my reports by next month," Jorkins forced out, turning on his heel with a sneer as he stalked out of the courtroom, in a way quite reminiscent of Hermione's old potions professor. Draco's steely eyes followed him out before he looked back at her. His eyes traced over her as if he was looking for any damage from the skeevy breeder. Hermione smiled up at him in reassurance and reached to interlock their hands together, a silent thank you. Draco's thumb swiped over hers. Want to learn how to make apple pie tonight? She offered. Draco grinned challengingly down at her, a hand reaching up to twist one of her curls around his index finger. You're so incredible. Draco murmured against her mouth, swallowing her gasping moans as he moved inside her. One of his hands gripped tight against her thigh as he pulled her closer to him. His tongue licked into her mouth, a slow, sensual, matching tempo to his hips, and Hermione whimpered. Draco, she bleated. So amazing. His voice was hoarse as he nipped at her lips. No one else can do what you do. So lucky to have. Draco broke off with a grunt, his fingers digging into the flesh of her thigh. Hermione's eyes fluttered as he twitched inside her. She barely pulled away from him to catch her breath before he was tugging her right back against his sweat-slicked chest, his kisses desperate as his lips tried to touch everywhere they could reach. Hermione felt both, suffocated, yet somehow too far away from him, and her arms lifted up to pull down his neck, bringing his lips back to hers in an eager, equally desperate kiss. Her skin positively hummed as he moaned into her mouth. It tasted like apples and sugar. His lips shifted, and then he was suddenly deeper, right there where she needed him to be. Hermione's head fell back and it gathered a cry of, "Oh! Oh my God!" One of his hands cupped her chin, and he whispered, breathless, "Look at me." Hermione felt his hips quickened as she held his eye contact. Grey eyes blown wide and hazy. She clenched around him as his pelvic bone brushed against her, and his eyes fluttered in clouded pleasure. "Hermione," he gasped out. Fuck, Hermione, His head quickly bowed to the nook between her neck and shoulder, and she felt his tongue lick at the sweat as he mouthed something unintelligible against her skin. So amazing, so brilliant, so beautiful, he panted against her neck. Hermione's eyes burned as she swallowed back a sob. Her skin was positively alive with her magic. Her heart an untamable beast against her ribcage, and she dug her fingernails into his shoulders. "Draco!" she pleaded again, her words fluttering around him as she got closer to the edge. Draco's thrust grew choppy, and Hermione's navel trembled as his fingers came between them to rub tight circles against her. A final choked groan, and her vision was nirvana. Hermione lay plastered against her bedsheets as Draco went to set the nightly wards. She knew she had to go to the bathroom to clean herself up, but she couldn't summon the energy to get her legs to obey her brain. Weakly, she reached for a wand and cast a quick cleansing charm, grimaced at her less than hygienic method. She made a mental note to check her local Muggle supermarket for pomegranate juice the next time she went, just in case. "And don't think I didn't notice your mangy fur all over my socks, you little shit," Draco muttered, appearing through a doorway. Draco quickly closed the door just as the ginger paw came into view, and he walked across her room, placing a glass of water on a bedside table, his other hand playfully flicking at her nose. "All right?" he asked, his voice quiet in her dark bedroom. She nodded, huffing out a laugh as he climbed over her to get to the other side of the bed. Draco evidently decided that taking the extra 10 steps must have been too strenuous a task for him. As they lay together, Draco's arm having snaked around her waist a few minutes ago, Hermione's mind worried with her thoughts as she thought back on the past couple of days. She glanced at the glass of water on her table before gazing back at him, and Hermione couldn't help but feel a wave of gratitude towards the man sleeping next to her. How he'd likely spend a whole day preparing meals for her, not knowing how long he'd be gone for, and knowing how terrible her eating habits got when she was stressed. How, after several long days of casting complex memory charms on an entire Muggle town, when he should really have taken a few days off from work to recuperate, he proceeded to pull an all-nighter to help Hermione with his speech, with nary a complaint. And the congratulatory bouquet of flowers he had delivered to her desk the morning of her hearing before she'd even met with the Wizengamot, because he was seemingly convinced she'd win. If this was what Draco was like just with his co-workers, she mused as her eyes traced over his peaceful face, what must he be like with his girlfriends? Hermione's eyes widened at the last sneaky thought that slipped the forefront of her mind, and she swallowed dryly, and coming up to rub her chest as it throbbed with a sudden acidic ache. Too much sugar from that apple pie, she tried to convince herself. They did warn it could cause heartburn. In case you didn't understand the concept of sleeping, Granger, it tends to help if you have your eyes closed. Draco drawled sleepily before asking a beat later, "What's wrong?" Hermione shook her head coming up to brush away a few strands of blonde locks that had fallen across his face. "It's just nice to have you back," she murmured. Draco's eyes shot open. His head lifted off of his pillow as he searched her expression, her face heating up at the intensity of his gaze, and she stuttered the implications of her words hitting her. At work. It's nice to have you. It's nice to have you back at work," she finished lamely with a shaky laugh. She could have sworn she saw something akin to pain flicker in his eyes, and Hermione barely had the time to process that thought before Draco leaned in, his hand pressing against the back of her head as he pulled her into a slow, deep kiss. Hermione's heart shuddered against the ribcage, and she breathed shakily against his lips. Draco pulled away just enough to nudge his nose against hers before he laid back down. "Go to sleep, Ranger," he yawned. "Merlin knows you need it." He was seemingly out in minutes, his arm a dead weight across her waist. Hermione's mind trickled back to her thoughts, more specifically that last devilish thought that had crept up before Draco had interrupted her musings, as she found herself snuggling closer in his arms. Draco's arm tightened around her subconsciously as she turned on her side to lay face to face with him. As the welcoming wave of sleep began to wash over her, Hermione's last thought before she dropped off was just how surprised she was at the sharp pain in her chest at the thought of Draco dating. Thank you for listening to today's chapter of Once More with Feelin by Wetpretzel, read by Elmix Marbella. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on AO3, YouTube, or Tumblr. Thank you to Wetpretzel for letting me read their story, and thank you to all of you for listening.